Chuck, give me a signal. Great. Hi everyone, my name is Betsy Cooper. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity here at UC Berkeley, and we are incredibly thrilled to have one of our grantees, Bill Marczak, present today. Bill is a computer science Ph.D. student here at UC Berkeley, and he's also a senior research fellow at CitizenLab, as well as a CLTC grantee. His research focuses on identifying and tracking nation-state information controls employed against dissidents, as well as government-exclusive lawful intercept malware tools. His work has resulted in the identification of the Great Canyon, an attack tool employed by China that hijacked millions of users' web browsers around the world to conduct DDoS attacks for censorship purposes. And he also discovered the first iPhone zero-day remote jailbreak seen in the wild. So we are thrilled to hear more about what you've been doing over the past few years, Bill. The floor is yours. We'll definitely leave time for questions at the end. So
thanks so much.
Bill.
Thanks so much, Betsy. Hi, everybody. As Betsy said in her lovely introduction, I am Bill Marczak, and this is actually my PhD dissertation talk. So after this, I guess I never have to give a talk again, although I probably will. Okay, so I'm a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley. In addition, I'm also a co-founder of this NGO called Bahrain Watch. Now, Bahrain Watch, we work on a variety of different sorts of advocacy and research projects related to Bahrain. And this is sort of the basis for a lot of the research that I'll be telling you about today. My engagement as an advocate, as an activist, as well as an academic, helped me conduct the research that I'll be presenting today. So we do, at Bahrain Watch, we do stuff like, this. We blocked a big tear gas shipment. We identify arms that are used by police. We identify PR companies that are providing services to the government. So this sort of work, my involvement in this sort of work gives me, helps build trust with dissidents and others who I then later use as research subjects with their consent, of course. So in addition, we recently came out with this really cool investigation looking at independence of think tanks at Bahrain Watch. You guys can read about it. I won't bore you with the details. And recently did some investigation into an internet disruption in Bahrain. So this is not really what I'm going to be telling you about today, but I just want to set kind of the context for the work. Additionally, I'm a senior researcher at CitizenLab, where, as Betsy said, I worked along with my co-author Nick Weaver, sitting in the back somewhere, on this research, which identified the Great Cannon, which was a tool employed most likely by the Chinese government to try and conduct denial of service attacks against US web hosting companies that were hosting censored content inside China, like GitHub and Amazon. And also, you guys might have seen this month's Vanity Fair issue, which I'll talk about a bit later in the talk. Okay, so another thing that I did at CitizenLab is also kind of tracing and identifying the proliferation of government-exclusive malware. So we'll talk a bit about this later. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is targeted digital surveillance against dissidents. And what exactly am I talking about? Well, if you've been following the news in the past couple of years, you might have seen some articles like these. Bahrain sentences Twitter users to prison. US citizen sues Ethiopia for using computer spyware. Spyware leaves trail to beaten activists through Microsoft flaw. American gets targeted by digital spy tools sold to foreign governments. Hackers lured Syrian rebels, this is one of my favorites, with sexy pics and then stole their battle plans. And there was this interesting article on Slate about how government-grade spy tech used a fake scandal to dupe journalists in Morocco. So there's been quite a lot of headlines on this topic if you've been following the news for the past couple of years. And most of this research is, of course, looking at what's being done overseas. But of course, given recent developments in this country, it's possible we could see some of this sort of research being applicable to dissidents or activists or civil society in the United States as well. So what I'm going to tell you today, kind of answering 4 questions that my research tries to address. The first one is, how are dissidents being targeted with surveillance? The second is, what's the potential scale of this activity? The third is, how might potential targets, or how do actually potential targets protect themselves? And finally, can computer science be part of the solution to this problem? So roughly the first question I'll answer through case studies for 2 Middle Eastern countries, the UAE and Bahrain, looking at how dissidents are targeted for surveillance. The second one I'll address through various empirical characterization techniques. For instance, looking at doing scanning of the internet, that map I showed you earlier, to see what sort of countries are doing this sort of targeting, what sort of governments are doing this sort of targeting. The third is I'll address through interviews with potential targets. So I actually did an on-the-ground research survey of dissidents in several Middle Eastern countries as well as members of the diasporas overseas. And the fourth, I'll propose kind of a system architecture and provide a bit of evaluation of a prototype implementation. All right, so let's jump right into question one. How are dissidents targeted? So this is a headline that you guys might have seen a couple years ago on Al Jazeera. And it says, Bahrain student sentenced for insulting king. And this guy, can't really make out his picture, but he's a high school student, and he was sentenced to 1 year in prison. He actually served 1 year in prison for allegedly insulting the king of Bahrain on Twitter. Now, he was accused of using this account, Al-Qawra News, which of course does not have his name. His name is Ali Al-Shafa, so his name's not in this account. In fact, the account kind of looks like this. It's just kind of like called Al-Qawra News, and you can see there's some YouTube channel, Twitter channel, a BlackBerry pin associated with the account. The account kind of posts pictures like this and news updates from this village in Bahrain called Al-Qawra. And so this is a particular image of a protest going on in the area. So how was this guy arrested? His name's not on the account. How did they get him, right? So we consulted the case files for this guy's case. And this dude, Colonel Fawaz Al-Sumaim from Bahrain's Cybercrime unit, actually testified at this guy's trial. And he said, it is in fact a secret investigation involving private methods of our department that cannot be disclosed. So unfortunately, this dude's not much help. We kept digging, though, in the court file, and we found this document. And for those of you that don't speak Arabic, I've translated the relevant portions here. So this is actually an order sent by Bahrain's public prosecution to uncover the user of an IP address of Al-Qawra News. So somehow, they associated this IP address from a residential ISP in Bahrain with this account, Al-Qawra News. And this is official. You can see it's signed by the prosecutor in Bahrain. So the question then became, okay, well, you're not supposed to really be able to associate an IP address with a Twitter account. Like, how could you possibly do that? You can't do this from passive surveillance or from just examining who's communicating with Twitter, because that's all encrypted. So you don't know who's accessing what account. So there had to have been some other thing going on here. So we contacted, oh, sorry, forgot this slide. So this document also contained more details about the investigation. And it said, through some investigations, they found this guy. It was actually his father, and so the guy's son was the guy allegedly operating the account. And he was accused of posting tweets saying the dictator Hamad or the mercenaries of the fallen Hamad, referring to the king of Bahrain, King Hamad. So this is kind of what this guy was accused of. So the question then, of course, becomes how do they associate the IP address with the account? You're not supposed to be able to do that. So we contacted Al-Qawra News, suspecting that maybe there was some sort of social engineering or some sort of link or attachment or whatnot, something that was sent to them that assisted in revealing their IP. So we asked, we pointed to this date, and we contacted the guys who run the account. It's apparently a group of people. And we asked them if they had received any suspicious messages around that date listed on the court order. And in fact, we found that they forwarded us this message. And it's from this user, Red Sky, on Facebook. He sent it to the Al-Qawra News Facebook account. And it says, I'm a translator. Do you need a translation of this? And then there's a link. And you can see that link is goo.gl. So that's actually run by Google. It's Google's URL shortener. So you can kind of put any URL in there and shorten it. So the question then is, okay, well, what is that masking? Like, what is behind that goo.gl URL, right? So we were able to actually look at the statistics, and we found there's this site called iplogger.org. So Google publishes, public URL statistics. If I have the goo.gl, I can see where it goes, and I can get some more information about it. So in this case, it was going to the site iplogger.org. And of course, this is kind of exactly what it sounds like. If you go to iplogger.org yourself, you'll see a place where you can create a short link. And it says, generate a special short URL that will redirect to any website. The logger will save the IP address of each user who clicks. as well as date and time, and other information about such clicks. Okay, so it sounds like we're getting warmer here, right? According to the analytics for goo.gl that they make publicly available, this was clicked only once from Facebook from Bahrain. So this kind of looks like we're getting much warmer here, right? In fact, Google also tells you the date and time at which the link was created. So we find that the difference between the click and the creation time, as measured by the date on the court order, is about 21 hours. So in other words, they associated this IP address with the account about 21 hours after the account received this IP logger link. So that's, in my view, pretty strong circumstantial evidence that this sort of technique was used, or in fact, probably this link was used to get this guy's IP address in this case. All right. So given that we knew that these sorts of IP logger links were being employed, probably by the government, we then set out to search Twitter for related activity. So we tried a couple things. We searched for related, iplogger.org links. We also found that some of these were shortened through a public account on bit.ly, which I'll get to in a bit. So we found, in particular, that this link matched the profile of the attackers, the links that the attackers were sending. And the interesting thing about this is a public Twitter conversation. And it kind of looks like there's two people in this conversation, right? Saudi44 and Al bin Sanad, right? Well, actually, there's three people, so that's wrong. This is a different user than this. Now, they look pretty much the same, right? The picture's the same. Al bin Sanad, like, it looks the same, right? However, the attackers used a really, really clever trick here. They used a capital I instead of a lowercase l. So this is AI bin Sanad, and this is AL bin Sanad. And it's actually visually indistinguishable. If you go to Twitter and do this, if you zoom in, like 1,000% zoom in, it's pixel for pixel identical. You can't tell it just from looking at it. So this was a very clever tactic. There's this third guy kind of interjecting into the conversation, saying, "Hey, check out this link." And it turned out to be an IP logger link. So that was a really clever technique we saw. We also saw even more insidious techniques that were used. So not just sending links, but sending emails that had embedded remote images inside them, designed to load when you opened up the email. So there's a bunch of sites out there. One of them is Read Notify. There's also Who Read Me and Point of Mail. And these sites kind of claim to be tracking for marketing purposes. However, they appear to be used quite extensively by Bahrain and other countries to get IP address or other related data from people, just from opening the email. And it turns out that this does actually work. It works particularly well on iPhones because this option to load remote images is set on by default on iPhones. So if you haven't changed this, then your iPhone is loading every single remote image and sending your IP address and browser information to whoever's embedded that remote image. However, if you use gmail.com or the Gmail app, they've started, as of 2013, they started proxying images, so you're not actually giving up your IP. It's like Google's fetching the image for you and then displaying it to you. So they see Google's IP, not yours. So that's good, but there could be more done by tech companies here to make people a bit safer. All right. So we were able to, as I mentioned earlier, kind of map out the scale of this activity. So this is what Vern and I call a perp chart, and it kind of shows a broad overview of what sort of activity we were able to link to various attacks and various consequences that people experienced. So here we see Al Kawara News, who clicked the link from, so the link was sent by Red Sky, who was the guy claiming to be a translator. He was actually arrested before that link was sent, and it appears the government used his credentials to log into his account and send the link. As I mentioned, we were able to link a lot of this activity to a user on bit.ly. It's kind of hard to see up there with that text, but there was a specific user on bit.ly who had a public profile. In other words, we could go to this user's profile page and see every single link that they shortened. So we were able to map this to a wide scale of activity. In fact, this was the same OPSEC fail that the Russians recently had when they were hacking all these, John Podesta's email. All those were shortened via a different, of course, public bit.ly account, which helped link that activity together. So this is one common technique that can be applicable in different cases to map out the scale of this activity. As you can see, there were also people who lost their jobs, who had their houses raided, and a couple other arrests. For full details, you can check out my dissertation. I go into these sorts of attacks in depth. The interesting thing is that we were able to actually attribute this to the cybercrime unit, not just through the arrest, but also because one of the accounts, Sabrina Ahmed, which was sending out these links, also shared this blog post called Cybercrime Unit on Facebook. And it's a cybercrime unit, cyber and cybercrime. We went to the person's profile on Blogger, and it turns out there was a person by the name of Usman Fazal who apparently works for the cybercrime unit. He gives his location of Bahrain, computer forensic examiner, military cybercrime unit. And this blog was shared at exactly the same time it was posted on Blogger. So in our view, pretty strong circumstantial evidence and a kind of puzzling OPSEC fail that this person would share, even start a blog called Cybercrime Unit. Yeah. Anyway, that was interesting, and kind of is emblematic of some of the amateurish OPSEC mistakes that some of these attackers, even high-level government attackers, do make. And it only takes one mistake to trace stuff back. All right. So in addition to these sorts of very potentially technically unsophisticated, but very socially sophisticated IP logger links. On the other end of the spectrum, there's also these very, very sophisticated hacking tools which governments are using. And there's a whole industry that's sprouted up around the increasing deployment of encryption and is pitching to governments, hey, you have new challenges today. The sensitive data you want to get is being transmitted over encrypted channels. So what are you going to do? You got to get it on the device. You've got to hack the device. And this is the pitch of companies like Hacking Team and a few others. In fact, there's a giant industry around this. ISS World stands for Intelligence Support Systems for Lawful Interception, Electronic Surveillance, and Cyber Intelligence Gathering. And this is a trade show that's held 6 or 7 times around the world every year. This is the latest brochure. So you can see they're having one in Dubai in March, one in Kuala Lumpur in December. They had ones earlier the year in DC, Mexico, South Africa, and Prague. And some of the companies that go to the show are Hacking Team, which is one of these companies that pitches these hacking tools to governments. Also FinFisher and NSO Group, 2 other companies that also sell hacking tools. Exodus and Zerodium, these guys sell bugs in software to companies or governments that they can then hack you using those bugs. And contractors like Dark Matter based in the UAE or Cyberbit based in Israel, which sell services as well as products to various government clients. So everybody gathers at this ISS World. The governments come, the companies come, and deals are made. Spyware is sold, exploits are sold. So, okay, so we saw some IP logger links targeting dissidents, as I mentioned, but dissidents are also targeted by this stuff, it turns out. So I want to go into one case which came up recently. It's a case that I call the $1 million dissident. There's this guy, a dissident based in the UAE, who I'll get into in a bit, who was targeted with 3 different tools over a period of 5 years. All right. So in addition to these sorts of really, really complicated, technically sophisticated hacking tools sold by companies, there's also these sorts of tools from the cybercrime underground, which are sort of similar. They're called rats. So there's Extreme Rat, Spynet Rat, NJ Rat, Dark Comet Rat, a bunch of different rats. And these are really cheap. You can get them for free or maybe for 40 euros, a very, very small fee. And basically you just get a piece of spyware that you can use to try and target people. And if you can infect their computers or their phones with the spyware, then you can see everything that's going on. You can take files off, you can turn on their webcam, you can turn on their microphone, anything. It allows you to see through your target's eyes. And it's kind of scary that this stuff is available very cheaply. I'm not going to talk about it much. You can see my dissertation for more details. I'm going to focus mostly on this, exciting, expensive, sexy government spyware. All right. So this guy, Ahmed Mansour, is a UAE dissident. He's a human rights activist. He signed a pro-democracy petition in 2011 at the height of the Arab Spring, which never really reached the UAE, but nevertheless, the government was very paranoid about it. He also won a prestigious human rights award in 2015, the Martin Annals Award, which is sometimes called a Nobel Prize for Human Rights. He couldn't actually travel to pick his award up because he was subject to a travel ban. Now, Back in August 2016, Mansour received a very interesting text message on his iPhone. It was an iPhone 6 and was running pretty much the latest version of iOS. And again, the Arabic says, "New secrets about torture of Emiratis in state prisons." And it contains a link here, https sms.webadv.co/ a bunch of numbers and an S at the end, right? And it's kind of weird, like it's from info SMS. Like, what is that? Have you ever gotten a text from info SMS about new secrets about torture? That's kind of weird, right? So Ahmed Mansour very quickly realized that something was amiss here. And as I mentioned earlier, with my connections and work with Bahrain Watch and activism in the region, so he kind of knew about me and reached out to me and forwarded me this message. So what did we do? Well, we saw that this was targeted at his iPhone 6 running pretty much the latest version of iOS. So we figured, well, maybe this is like an attack on iPhones. Maybe there's like something going on here that's specific to iPhones. So me and my colleague Nick Weaver, who's might have left already. So Nick and I kind of went into our shared office at ICSI and decided that what we were going to do was click on this link using Nick's girlfriend's old iPhone, which she graciously volunteered. So what we did is we basically got Nick's girlfriend's iPhone and connected it to a laptop using, and the laptop was running a couple tools to help us kind of intercept what the traffic was going back and forth between the phone and the internet. Basically, we wanted to capture everything to see what exactly clicking on this link would do. Like, what would it do to the phone? So we set up these tools, MITM proxy and Wireshark. And of course, we wiped the phone and disabled mobile data to force it to connect to Wi-Fi through this laptop so we could make sure to capture everything and not miss anything. And then what we did is we opened Safari on the iPhone and we transcribed the link that Mansour sent. And we clicked go and waited to see what happened. So the first thing that happened is the Safari window on the phone spontaneously closed, which shouldn't happen. It's not a normal behavior. Like, a normal website can't just like close a Safari window. It was indicative that the application, that the Safari had somehow crashed or been deliberately closed. So we thought, maybe there's something interesting going on here. Meanwhile, we were looking at that laptop that was doing the Wireshark and MITM proxy to capture all the internet traffic, and we saw all this junk on Wireshark. Like this, so this was all the communications going back and forth between the phone and the internet. So we basically saw, once we were able to kind of analyze this and see what was going on, we saw there were kind of 3 distinct stages that were downloaded from this sms.webadv.co website that was in the link. The first one was just a web page that had some really bizarre looking JavaScript in it. The second was appeared to be some shell code, in other words, some code to, just like iPhone bytecode to run on the phone. And the third was actually an iOS app. So it appeared that there was some app being installed on the phone surreptitiously. Like, you're not supposed to be able to do this, right? iPhone apps can only come through the App Store or super trusted channels. So this was indicative to us, the fact that this app was being downloaded and apparently installed on the phone, that something really interesting was going on here. And so the other lines, by the way, I should mention here, like the NTF bid, NTF XP, NTF GOG, those appear to just be giving information. It's just the phone giving information back to the server on kind of the progress of executing all these commands. So it appeared that basically whoever was doing this had very carefully configured and instrumented their code to have quality assurance and logging. So this appeared to be pretty professional just from looking at this. The interesting thing was, after that, we saw that the phone started posting data back to some other server, which we suspected was a spyware command and control server. In other words, we suspected the phone had been infected and was sending back data just from clicking on a link, which was very unusual. So I said, Nick and I are in the office, I'm like, okay, I think we should shut this down. And then Nick, so you can actually, this has actually happened, you can read about it in Vanity Fair. Nick was like, dang, it feels good to be a gangsta. We shut down the phone. We put it in a metal box, or it's just a metal filing cabinet to create a Faraday cage, so there would be absolutely no communication. We were worried that it was going to send GPS coordinates back or something. They'd see that this, they were trying to target Ahmed Mansour in Dubai, but the phone was actually in the International Computer Science Institute, which would be bad.
They now know after Vanity Fair, though, right?
Right, yeah. Well, Yeah. So okay. So we did this. We shut down the phone, and So what did we get? Well, we got in touch with a security firm, Lookout, and they helped us do some of the analysis of this very complex code that we got. It turned out that there were the three main stages downloaded from the server corresponded to kind of three bugs that were in the iPhone. So the first was that there was this bug where you could actually take control of Safari on the iPhone just by visiting a maliciously crafted website. So whoever had done this had kind of found these bugs and, exploited this. That was the first thing they exploited. The second was there was actually a bug in the iPhone kernel where you could kind of get information about where the kernel was located in memory. One important part of modern security on operating systems and phones is to try and put things at random locations in memory so an attacker can't guess where they're going to be. It makes it much harder for exploits and bugs to be successfully leveraged to hack people. But they found a way around that. And they also found a way to execute code with kernel privileges. And the kernel is, of course, the base of the operating system. So if you can execute with kernel privileges, you can take control of the entire phone and subvert any sort of other security precautions that might be on the phone. And it turned out, once we had kind of identified that this is what was going on, we talked to Apple. We disclosed these issues to Apple. And 10 days later, they came out with a patch. And there were three different CVEs, three different vulnerabilities here. 2016 4655 through 4657. Okay, so this is kind of what was going on in terms of the installation of that malicious app. But what actually was the malicious app? Well, we were able to kind of look at it and see what sort of functionality it had. So I mentioned it was sending data back to this command and control server. Well, it could send information back, including emails that were on the phone, SMSs, could even record from the microphone or webcam. It could intercept instant messaging apps, including WhatsApp or phone calls on WhatsApp, phone calls on Viber, in addition to regular phone calls. So it was pretty much a complete compromise of the device. Anything that you had on there, the spyware could get off and send to the server. So this appeared to be the first ever malicious remote jailbreak that had been found in the wild. A jailbreak, for those of you who aren't familiar, originally the term came about when when the iPhone first came out. Apple took very strong security precautions, as they still do, to try and make sure that you could only install things from the App Store and that they can kind of maintain control over the platform. So jailbreaking referred to people who wanted to install unauthorized apps on their phone just for fun or for customizability or for learning purposes. So people started developing jailbreaks just to assist others in installing unauthorized apps on their phones. Just nothing malicious about it. But of course, these sorts of jailbreaks can also be used to install, of course, any app. So you can install a malicious app with them. And a remote jailbreak refers to the fact that this can be activated just through the click of a link. So this is a very, very valuable thing for people who want to hack your phone. And it turns out that there were several bug rewards issued not by Apple, but by a third-party company called Zerodium. So Zerodium is a company that sells exploits. I mentioned them earlier. They're one of the attendees of ISS World. So it appeared that they had put out this bounty and that someone had actually claimed it. This was a remote jailbreak for iOS 9. And they also came out with a $1.5 million bounty recently for a remote jailbreak for iOS 10, just to give you a sense of how valuable these sorts of things are, so how valuable what we captured was. Okay, so we'd kind of known that this was going on, but the question still remained. As Vanity Fair put it, you can see Jennifer Lawrence on the cover here. As Vanity Fair put it, who hacked Silicon Valley's crown jewel? Like, who was behind the jailbreak that we found and the spyware that we found? Maybe it was Zerodium, maybe not. So we investigated. So our starting point was looking at this link. So this link, of course, when we clicked on it the first time, we got all those crazy exploits and spyware. It turned out that it was a single-use link. So when we clicked on it again, we actually got a different response. So we were redirected actually to a file /redirect.aspx. Kind of weird. We looked at what that was. And I guess you can't really see it on this projection here, but it's basically just a very short blob of code that redirects you to Google. So basically, if you had clicked on this link a second time, it would just redirect you to Google. And you just see like Google. And you wouldn't be infected. You just see Google in your web browser. OK. It's kind of weird, right? So one technique that turns out is really valuable in terms of attributing and tracing these sorts of types of spyware is to kind of look and see, is this behavior a bit odd? And it does look pretty odd. Like there's kind of like 2 meta redirects in here to Google. It doesn't look like something that is very common. So our hypothesis was, yeah, that's weird. Let's see if we can find other instances of this and see what they are. So we scanned the whole internet. We used ZMAP. It's a really great tool for scanning the internet. And we found only 149 out of 4 billion IP addresses, 149 of them match this fingerprint of returning that weird redirection to Google. Then our next question was, OK, well, we have this interesting group of 149 IPs. How do they behave in the past? Maybe there's some past behavior that we can use to figure out more. So it turns out there's a bunch of really cool ways that you can scan, or you can search through past results of internet scans. So Census, Shodan, these are just websites where you can go and type in search queries. There's also sites like scans.io where you can download old internet scanning if you're into that. And then in 2012, there was a big, kind of one of the first major large-scale internet scans conducted actually through a botnet, which is pretty interesting. OK, so we had all this data, and we were kind of looking for what those 149 matching IPs did in the past. And we found out that they returned this other really weird-looking Google redirect. Like, what's up with these Google redirects, right? So our next question was, OK, 19 of these 149 IPs returned this really weird Google redirect. And then, of course, OK, branching out from that, what else returned that really weird redirection? And there were 89 IPs that returned that in total, including IPs pointed to by 3 domain names, nsoqa.com, mail1.nsogroup.com, and qaandqa.com. All 3 domains were registered by this company, NSO Group, based in Israel, NSO Group. We found a brochure for NSO Group. NSO Group is a leader in the field of cyber warfare, it said. The system introduces a powerful and unique monitoring tool called Pegasus, which allows remote and stealth monitoring and full data extraction, exclusively for the use of government law enforcement and intelligence agencies. OK, that's interesting, right? So yeah, it appeared that what the spyware that Ahmed Mansour had received in this link was actually NSO Group's spyware. So of course, the question is, of course, why do they have these weird Google redirects, right? So it turns out that not only NSO, but also, according to my research into hacking team in FinFisher, you can see my dissertation, a lot of these different companies have this notion of redirecting to another page if you type in the address of the command and control server in your web browser. I don't know why they do it, but they do it. The hacking team manual says you can set a decoy page. And it turns out that Google and Apache are popular decoys. Apache is a popular web server. So a lot of these servers, if you used to type the IP address into your web browser, you'd get like a redirect to Google or an Apache error page or something like that. And you can read all about this in my dissertation. There's kind of subtle differences and errors between actual hacking team servers and Apache servers. They look the same, but there's like really subtle differences, like using UTC instead of GMT for the date, or like these weird things. One really interesting thing that we found was that FinFisher servers were actually kind of doing something very weird. So when you put an address of a FinFisher server into Google, so that's a FinFisher server, and you'd see Google, but of course it's not a Google IP. So it's some FinFisher server IP that's returning Google, sort of. So we were thinking, okay, we've got Google. Like, what do you search for? Well, how about my IP address, right? Because you can see here, we've put an IP address into Google. It hasn't redirected us to Google. It's just given us a Google page. So maybe there's something like behind this that we can figure out. That's odd. We got an IP address in Indonesia, right? Like, we're accessing an IP address in the US. We got an IP address in Indonesia. And it turned out that this IP address also matched our FinFisher fingerprint. So this is really weird, right? We've got 2 FinFisher IP addresses here. We put one into Google. We asked Google what our IP address is, and we got another one. to what's going on. But what we thought happened was something like this. So we thought that there might be like a series of proxy servers and then a command and control server located on the premises of the government agency that was using this spyware. And when we asked, what is my IP, that would be forwarded from our measurement machine to the command and control server, and then forwarded to Google, and Google would say, oh, your IP is this, which is the IP address of the government agency, and would then forward that back to our measurement machine. We'd get the IP address of the government agency that was using this, even if we were only able to find the proxy. So this would work even if the command and control server was firewalled. So it's kind of like, the way to think of this is kind of like a game of telephone. Like you've got a bunch of people, and they're each asking, what is my name, right? And the my is different in each case. So the measurement person asks, what is my name? And then this person, the penultimate person, asks, what is my name to Google. And then Google will say some name. Maybe your name is Tiffany, which is the name of my girlfriend here, who's also mentioned in the Vanity Fair piece, interestingly. Okay, so this is basically what's going on here and how we found these IP addresses. So what do we do once we have the IP address of the command and control server, right? So we've got kind of this picture of what's going on. We've got proxy servers and we've got the command and control server on the government agency premises. But it turns out that a lot of these government agencies, as we found, also have other things running from that IP address, like maybe a public-facing web server or a mail server, or maybe there's some devices on their premises which are using that IP address as an internet gateway. So, of course, as you saw earlier, we got some IP address in Indonesia, right? It was just an IP address in Indonesia. We didn't know what it was. But perhaps by using these sorts of techniques, by looking for those sorts of devices, we could potentially attribute the agency to a specific, the IP address to a specific agency, right? So this is one interesting example that I'll step through pretty quickly. So we found a FinFisher server at some IP address here. And we also found, so this is an interesting case where we were able to use data from another company hacking team to actually attribute this FinFisher server. So hacking team, you guys might have heard, one of these companies that sells spyware, they themselves were actually hacked last year. And 400 gigabytes of all their emails and code and everything was leaked online. So this is one of those emails that we found. You can go to WikiLeaks, they're searchable on WikiLeaks. So we found actually an email was sent from an IP address which we found a FinFisher server at. That's weird, right? It turns out that this was sent by a guy who was supposed to be in Egypt doing a delivery for a client called the Technical Research Department of the Egyptian Intelligence, which we found out reports directly to this dude, the president of Egypt. So, in this case, we were able to come up with a very strong case of attribution from this IP address using leaked emails and leaked data because someone had sent an email from an IP address which matched the internet gateway for the spyware server. In other cases, it's even easier. So there's this great resource passive total where you can kind of figure out which domain names point to which IP addresses. And we found a FinFisher server at this IP, which was pointed to by a domain like intelligence.isf.gov.lb, which turns out to be the Lebanese Internal Security Forces. So it appears they were another user of this. So that's kind of a flavor of how we did that sort of attribution. Okay. And we published yearly reports on our scanning results for these various spyware companies, and we found a wide variety of countries using this sort of stuff, ranging from countries that are pretty repressive, like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, to other sorts of countries like South Korea or Italy, which you don't frequently associate with repressive behavior. We also found, for FinFisher, particularly in Africa and Venezuela, Turkmenistan, actually, one of the most repressive countries in the world. So not necessarily the best sort of places where you'd want governments to have robust surveillance capabilities. So we published this, and what happens next, of course, will shock you. They stopped using these decoy pages, which we were really able to easily fingerprint and trace, and they just start closing the connection now if you try and scan them. But you can still build fingerprints, it turns out, and see the dissertation for details. And there's a bunch of more details about the scanning, blah, 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 more spyware attacks, more empirical analysis, good stuff. I encourage you to check it out. Okay, and I'll try and go through really quickly. I think I have, 3 or so minutes left. Okay, so the next part of my dissertation was looking at how do these targets protect themselves, right? So we kind of see how they're targeted, but what are they doing as a result? And this part of the work involved interviewing 30 potential targets on the ground in GCC countries, a Gulf Cooperation Council, so like Bahrain, UAE, et cetera, and abroad as well. And in general, they perceive that there's at least some risk. The main things they're worried about are being from their online activities. The main things they're worried about are being spied on, perhaps being punished, like being arrested or tortured, having unwanted publicity, consequences for friends, financial problems, etc. And to some extent, they also believe that the government is tracking their online activities. And this is broken down into 4 different study groups. You can read the dissertation for full details. But essentially, you can see that a lot of people kind of view that their government is definitely tracking their online activities. In fact, some subjects we interviewed actually had some consequences that they experienced as a result, they believe, of their online activities, including physical assault, prison, being sacked from their jobs, allegedly having their email accounts hacked, having direct threats from authorities, having people posting messages on their accounts saying that they're working with the government. So we kind of also did, in addition to asking people questions, we did testing of their mobile phones and computers to see what sort of security problems they might have. We identified that quite a few of the phones we examined, in fact 19 out of 28 were not encrypted, meaning that if they were physically confiscated, the government could, for instance, take passwords or other data off the phone and perhaps control or commandeer the victim's online accounts. So a bunch of people had some problems with this. People said, oh, I enabled it, but the phone doesn't prompt for a password. So just kind of illustrating general usability issues and misconceptions around the feature, which caused some people to actually not enable encryption or decide to disable it. It turned out that a lot of people liked having these pattern passwords as well, rather than typing in a password. They found it more convenient and more easy to use, but they couldn't figure out, some people couldn't figure out how to use a pattern password with encryption on Android phones, which is one of the reasons people didn't enable that option. Also, most subjects that we interviewed don't really have any sort of strategy if they were to lose their phone. A couple people said they'd trace their phone. 5 people said they'd trace their phone. 1 person said they'd do a remote wipe. 3 people just said, oh, I'll just, take everything from a backup and just keep going on. But most people didn't really have a strategy about potentially locking down their accounts or preventing the abuse of their accounts in the future. And in fact, a few people even had issues. 9 phones we examined didn't have any password whatsoever on the phone. Just further making it easier for people who obtain the phone physically to exploit data on the phone. And a lot of people had this option enabled called sideloading, which has the property that you can install apps. This is only for Androids, but there's an option that allows you to install apps from outside the App Store. And it's suboptimal to have this enabled because it reduces a barrier to you accidentally installing an unwanted app. So actually, one out of 6 of the 6 phones that we found with sideloading enabled was an iPhone, which means that it was jailbroken. And a lot of people enable this to install apps like Grooveshark, Aptoid, Popcorn Time for piracy purposes. One person actually used it to install a second copy of WhatsApp, which you can't normally do. So he had one WhatsApp with his regular number and one WhatsApp with an anonymous phone number. And he felt that kind of added to his security, even though his phone was jailbroken. And 2 subjects didn't really know why that option was enabled. And as I said, it's an issue because we've seen these sorts of links distributing spyware to app files, like APK files on Androids. And if you just click on that and you have sideloading enabled, it removes one of the prompts that you see or one of the warnings that you see before that's actually installed on your phone. And some of the phones we examined, two of the 28 phones were rooted, meaning that they were either jailbroken or on Android it's called rooting. And it allows you to install kind of unauthorized apps, especially on Android. Rooting allows you to install apps that take full control of your system, such as this one subject who had installed an app called X Privacy to enable fine-grained permissions control. But the bottom line here is that spyware that gets on your phone can have additional functionality. Like it can take more stuff if your phone's already rooted and the phone, or the spyware doesn't contain any exploits. So if you've already rooted your phone, you've already kind of like shot yourself in the foot if you get infected. We also found issues with updates. So only 4 out of 18 Android phones we found were up to date with their Android phone software version. One of them was 1,100 days out of date, which was kind of interesting. One common problem with Androids is they stop receiving updates after a certain period of time determined by the manufacturer. I think Google's probably trying to make efforts to make that better.
Determined by the carrier.
Yeah, or the carrier. Yeah. Right. So this is also an issue because some spyware vendors have exploits for older versions of browsers or operating systems. We also found that a lot of people, 12 out of 30, didn't have any strategy if they lost access to an online account like Gmail, Twitter, or Facebook. But we found broad awareness that governments would seek to get passwords for these accounts, especially if the person was arrested, and that governments would seek to exploit passwords to try and target their friends, like we saw with this case where this arrested activist, then his account was used to target friends. Okay. Should I just stop or should I?
I mean, finish what you need to, but.
Okay. I have, maybe I should just jump ahead to the conclusions. I have a ton of slides, which unfortunately I didn't get to go through. Okay.
Will the slides be available later?
Yes, the slides will be available later. So I'll just quickly jump to this potential defensive solution. So this is kind of motivated by the fact that dissidents, according to our interviews, didn't really have a good sense of how to, or didn't really seem to have a good sense of how to vet messages they received to see whether they were potentially malicious or not. And as we saw, there were a lot of these attacks involve malicious messages, like the malicious text message sent to Ahmed Mansour, or the malicious Facebook message sent to Al Qawara News. So we decided to develop and prototype a system called Himaya, which is the Arabic word for protection. And it's basically an online cloud-based service that scans emails at the moment, and we're going to hopefully expand that to Facebook accounts and Twitter accounts soon. And so if you go to Himaya and you authorize access to your Gmail account, it'll begin scanning all the messages and alert you if there's anything suspicious. And of course, since this does involve downloading the messages onto our servers, we've thought through in quite some detail the architecture that we want in order to make sure that compromise of this, perhaps by nation state actors or anyone who wants to read people's emails who are being scanned, to ensure that this sort of compromise doesn't result in disclosure of sensitive information. So basically, the short version is that we segregate different functionality onto different physical machines, and we also have internal firewalling to make sure that any sort of compromise is localized in one component, especially since we're doing things like running attachments in a virtual machine, which could potentially introduce a vector for compromise of our scanning tool. So we have a prototype implementation with about 36 subjects. We've scanned a bunch of emails. We've detected some malicious emails. We found a couple of old attacks. We found a couple of real-time attacks as well. So this tool does both scanning of old messages as well as messages in real time as they're received. So we found an interesting case where a Bahraini activist was targeted with some malware. And it was, so I'll just kind of walk you through to help you understand what sort of functionality the scanner has. So the spyware arrived as a link in an email, and the link went to one of these online file sharing services like Mediafire or ForShared, one of these online file downloading services. And the file was actually a password protected zip file containing a Word document which used a macro to install spyware on the computer. So basically, what our tool Himaya was able to do was download the file, crack the password using every word in the email as a potential password, observe, run the Word document in a virtual machine, observe it drop an executable file, and alert the subject that there was a potentially malicious email in their account. We also discovered one case where it was a previously unknown piece of spyware targeting an activist in the UAE. And the subject actually thought the message was benign and tweeted about it and said, oh, the email looked totally legit. I was initially very excited, but then I got a notification from Bill's email scanning program that monitors emails for attacks. Actually, the unfortunate part was he got the notification after he had opened the email. Thankfully, he wasn't infected, but this kind of suggests that we should kind of improve notifications. We've explored delivering them via WhatsApp or SMS on mobile phones. Right now, they're just sent via email. All right, so in the future, what we want to do is perhaps get feedback on these alerts and improve the alerts, as well as, when we send an alert, ask, hey, did you think this was suspicious? Other types of behavioral signaturing, maybe to look for exploits, as well as trying to detect phishing, which is a tough problem because there's not anything that really takes control of your computer. It just relies on, perhaps convincing you through visual similarity that this is actually an email from Google that you want to click on and input your password in, right? So looking at maybe perhaps visual similarity or other sorts of ways to detect phishing. So finally, conclusion. Apologies for going over. Broadly, what I've told you today is that these malicious links and files, these messages are a significant threat to activists. Some of these, of course, use these really interesting, sexy commercial spyware tools, which are widely used, as I showed you on the maps, and likely abused throughout the world. Dissidents are vulnerable to these sorts of threats in that they don't necessarily have the right sense or the time to check the messages and vet the messages that they receive that are often the vector for these sorts of attacks. So the proposal is to develop the system to help dissidents better vet messages by telling them, hey, this looks like it's malicious because it drops a executable file and tries to install a program on your computer. Overall, I want to say a lot of this work has been done through CitizenLab. It's been great. One issue, which I think Vern and I have faced, is that it's been a bit hard to get some of the case study work, like looking at Bahrain and UAE, accepted into academic venues. And it would be great if we had venues like CitizenLab. So CitizenLab is, of course, a lab. But it would be great to have publication venues in computer science, I think, that were not, of course, supplanting existing venues, but complementing existing venues. Places where you could, for instance, submit anytime and have quick turnaround peer review with an emphasis on, short form, high impact research, not necessarily, generalizable knowledge, but perhaps these sorts of, types of case studies where you have to have, or where you benefit from having, strong academic expertise and knowledge applied to a kind of a real world issue. And also facilitating kind of just-in-time collaboration like the lab does. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge my colleague John from CitizenLab, who's been a huge part of this research. Amazing. I'd also like to acknowledge my committee, Vern, who's here, Ron Diebert from Berkeley, Eric, who's also here, and Deirdre from the iSchool, and a bunch of academic colleagues, InfoSec colleagues, funders, CLTC, of course, for hosting me and putting on this delicious lunch spread, and of course, NGO collaborators, which I could not have done this research without. And of course, all my friends in Korea with the tear gas campaign, and Bahrain and the UAE. And yeah, thank you very much.
I think we'll have time for one or two questions, even though we're running over, and then I'm sure Bill can stick around and answer more off the live stream. So.
Do you have to be on the room immediately?
Sorry?
Do we have to leave the room immediately?
I do not know.
I'll go the book for half an hour after.
Yeah.
So.
Questions?
Yeah.
So, the problem I see with Amaya is that we have to ship all our emails to you.
Yeah.
And so there's A, a trust issue, and B, you then have the emails sort of in perpetuity. So it's not just trusting you now, but trusting that your accounts don't get further broken into.
Right.
Anyway, but our cell phones are fairly powerful. Is there any way of taking a tool like Amaya and making it so we can install it on our own laptop or cell phone?
Great questions. With respect to your first question, we don't actually preserve emails unless they're marked as malicious by Amaya. And subjects can opt out at any time and destroy all the data of theirs that we hold. I think perhaps this is one potential area. Of course, we still have the API keys, the passwords to access their accounts. Not their actual password, but basically like a password associated with our app, Himaaya. So we can't kind of like see what their password is, but we can access their accounts. So this is potentially one area where further integration with Google or other services could help in, perhaps having, a system where we can only access each message once, and then once we access it, scan it, and delete it, we're kind of forbidden by Google from accessing that again. So that's something potentially to explore in future collaboration with these platforms. With regard to running it on your phone or your own computer, that's one of the things that we've thought about is potentially for NGOs or organizational type deployments, we'd have a machine actually in the organization that would be doing the scanning. There's a couple things which make it kind of tricky for everyone to be running this. One of them is that, of course, security is very much an arms race. And one of the things that Himaaya benefits from is being this cloud-based service where it's not just, because we know that these spyware companies scan against antiviruses. So it can't, we don't want to have something where it's just like, oh, the company goes and they install Himaaya, like FinFisher, hacking team install Himaaya, and they test their products to make sure they modify their products until they're no longer detected. So what we want is that we want this trade-off where we kind of say to them, hey, you can sign up for Himaaya and test it, but the risk is that you'll be sending us your spyware if you try and test it. So that's kind of illustrating some of the trade-offs that with respect to that.
One more question? Why do browsers not forbid, why do they allow that ambiguity between the one and the L and things?
Yeah, so it's actually a really tough problem. So it's kind of like it's not necessarily just a browser issue. It's also like if you go into certain types of fonts, you go into like Microsoft Word or whatever, and you type certain letters or numbers kind of look pretty similar. So it's mainly, I think, like a font issue in that respect. And when people design fonts, they don't really think about, oh, people could get attacked because these letters look similar. So I think potentially. It's difficult to kind of, the first part is kind of like figuring out, well, who's responsible, who should make a change in response to this problem. And my view on it is like, well, you should potentially go to Twitter, these companies and say, hey, there should be better ways to kind of distinguish between accounts that are designed to look substantially similar, right? Because even if the character, the I, is rendered slightly different than the L, we also saw like some Twitter accounts where two letters were reversed, like an E and an I were reversed, or an E and an A were reversed, and they were designed to look pretty similar. So even just glancing at that, it's you could be fooled. So I think the solution is to have better differentiation to indicate that, hey, these are two different accounts, and have that be very visually apparent. Maybe like by, I don't know, changing the background color of the tweet, or who knows.
Well, thank you so much. On behalf of CLTC, your first present for finishing your dissertation. And we are thrilled to have you. So thank you all for being here. We will end the formal program, but I'm sure Bill will stick around to answer a few more questions. And we'll see you next semester. Thanks again.